because it's Easter, I thought I'd do something maybe more appropriate for Easter, and something I haven't actually spoken about really in more than 20 years. It hasn't really been part of my life in any way, but it's kind of interesting if you're interested in archaeology. I was a student in the year 2000, and I won a scholarship, and I went to a field school run by American archaeologists from the University of Puget Sound, and it was in the Galilee. And at the time there was a big debate over where Cana was. Cana is in the Bible. It's the place where Jesus sort of begins his story, his actual adventures, but there's a wedding feast. It might actually have been his own wedding feast. There's some debate about that, but in the wedding feast he changed water into wine. Well, that's how the story goes anyway. So also Cana was one of a small number of places which definitely mentioned as existing that could be historically identifiable. However, the problem was, although we knew from history and various records that there had been a Cana there, and it had existed for a long time, there was some. It was so long ago that nobody was quite sure what the location was. At the time, a small town called Cana, or Cana, was believed to be the actual place. However, the American archaeologists from Puget Sound, led by an archaeologist called Douglas Edwards, who sadly now is deceased, but they identified this tell, which is basically a mound with some historical artifacts on it, and it was a few miles away from Cana, and they, based on various accounts that they'd studied, they believed that this was actually the location of the biblical Cana. Now, what they were actually looking for, they found lots of evidence. They found evidence of a cobbled road. They found a Byzantine column and various things. They found a cave, and when I was there, a cave was excavated that had remarkable Christian symbols carved into it. But one thing that they needed above all else was to prove that there had been some sort of either a temple or a synagogue there, or a church, because according to the records there had in fact been I think in the 5th century a church there. So they knew that if they could get back closer to the time, like 5th century or 4th century, I think even the church may have been founded in the 4th century, then they knew they had the right place. This was the Cana of the Bible. So what they were looking for was some artifacts that could prove there had been either a synagogue or a church. There's some debate now, there's evidence mounting that the first churches were sort of synagogues. They actually looked like synagogues, but they were different. They had different kinds of decorations and things. There's mounting evidence about that, but they needed some evidence anyway, because if there was a synagogue, there probably would have been a church, or at the very least it was the right place they were looking for. So I was there in the summer, and the dig went on in July and August, and a bit before and a bit after, but I was there in July and August in the year 2000. So I just have my journal here from that excavation, and it's kind of interesting because what I wrote was, today, it was July the 19th and it was a Wednesday. Today I went to be an apprentice to Peter the architect. He showed me how to take measurements, identify walls and human action upon stone. And that's Peter Richardson, who is very well known in biblical archaeology. He's quite famous. Every time there's a program about Jesus or the historical Jesus or something like that, he's in it, usually, always. And he was, as far as I know, Canadian, and he was with the University of Toronto at the time, or Toronto as they say. And he was there to basically identify the kinds of artifacts that would actually sort of be the smoking gun that would prove it was the right place. So we visited cisterns with one of the Trimbles, the family who make the GPS systems, because they were actually sponsoring the dig. Then with Judy, who was a dentist, who was she was interested in archaeology and she paid to go on the dig. With Judy in tow, we visited the graves on the base of the hill. Judy filmed them. She had a video camera at the time, and God, digital was still a bit away for most of us. She hadn't got digital though, she had a tape. There were huge crickets inside and rafter spiders. The rafter spiders built huge sheets of web inside the caves, kind of like the ones you see in the movies, but that's actually the rafter spider you could find in your own house. But when they're left in caves, which they seem to originate from, Middle Eastern caves, they build sheets of webs, and there could be 20 of them all living into one giant web. Judy would frequently scream every time we saw something scary. After breakfast, an extraordinary event happened. Peter asked me to search on the Arab walls around the entrance of the cave. The second rock I happened to pick up had carvings on it, and basically these were piles of rocks that had already been examined, but they'd been just put to one side because, you know, they weren't sure if there was anything in it. But I was asked to look at them just to be a pair of fresh eyes, and if I noticed anything that looked like a man-made or a carving or anything like that that was a bit unnatural. The second rock I happened to pick up had carvings on it. I showed them to Peter. I showed the rock to Peter. He could not believe his eyes. In fact, his words were, "Holy moly." He actually told me, "Dad, no, that's nothing." And then suddenly he said, "Oh, wait a minute, holy moly." And when I showed it to him, he suddenly realized what it was, and it was something that I was to see again when I visited Jerusalem a few weeks later. And this was the end of a thing called a chancel piece, which is kind of like a stone bar, and has these sort of it's almost like hinge carvings in it, so that they could slot a kind of a hinge into it. And what the chancel piece was for holding an altar together. And at some point it had been broken up and used as wall filler, but this tiny piece, and it would have been about, maybe the full thing would be about 1.5 meters long, I think, and this was just the head, the end of one of them where the bolts were fitted. And so that was it. We had actually found something really exciting, which was part of what would be the wall or the front of an actual altar. Now the question was it a Christian altar or was it a Jewish, like an earlier altar, or when did it date from? There would have been possibly the Christian church and a synagogue at the same time there. It's hard to know for sure, but later on I did actually see an identical looking chancel piece, the full thing though, so I got to see what it looked like in Jerusalem, and I think that one was dating from the 3rd century BC, or BCE as we say now, before the Common Era. So this was part of the evidence that has led to Khirbet Cana, which is ruined Cana, being regarded as the biblical Cana. So it is the place mentioned in the Bible, and that was my very small part in it, which I haven't really spoken about in years and years. I haven't spoken it. People, you know, you could talk about things like that and people wouldn't be that interested. It was kind of as regards archaeology, it was probably the most interesting thing I ever took part in, and the most important thing I ever had a hand in finding. And it's you can look it up online and you can find out more about it. But just look up Khirbet Cana, and that's Khirbet, that means ruined Cana, and Cana is Cana or Qana. That's usually how you find it written. So that's, as it's Easter, that's just my little story of something I took part in. But the thing that actually struck me most about the whole adventure, I kind of fell in love with nature again in a big way.